Hi, everybody. This is Frederick Meyer with Writers.com. I'm joined by Margo. I say it's Steines, but I'm probably wrong.
The only person who said it right without correction. So
Yes.
it rhymes with
Okay.
kindness.
Okay. Steines rhymes with highness. So, hi, Margo. Um, and we're going to talk about confessional writing and Margo's new, I think, confessional memoir and essay is called Brutalities. So, just a little bit about Margo. Margo is a native New Yorker, a journeyman iron worker, and serves as mom to a wildly spirited small person. Margo holds an MFA in nonfiction writing from the University of Arizona and lives and writes in Tucson. Her work was named notable in Best American Essays and has appeared in The Sun, Brevity, Off Assignment, The New York Times' Modern Love section, the anthology Letter to a Stranger, Essays to the Ones Who Haunt Us, and elsewhere. She is the author of the memoir and essays Brutalities, A Love Story. Margo is faculty at the University of Arizona Writing Program, is also a private creative coach and creative writing class facilitator. You can read more about Margo at margosteines.com. So I'd love to dive into it with just some like kind of on a feel level before we get into a lot of ideas. So Margo, I know you brought a passage or some passages from Brutalities that you'd like to read us, and I'd just love to turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Fred. I'm going to read a little bit from my book um, for about 5 minutes or so. And this essay is very much in spirit of this discussion because it is full of all of the kinds of things that you're only supposed to talk about in therapy. Um, and I'm just going to read the first couple sections of it. On a Saturday morning, after we drank black coffee out of round-bellied cups, N showed me how to punch him in the face. We were still new, still enjoying lazy hours of just looking at each other, both marveling at what we had found. It was late in the morning, and we had slowly disentangled our bodies and climbed out of my bed to stand beneath the high desert sun over my Tucson neighborhood's public park. The heat cut through the crisp, dry November air. We nestled the coffee cups at the base of a tree. N showed me how to curl my fingers into a fist that wouldn't break on impact. Pinky finger first, then ring, middle, pointer, each one slightly prouder of the base than the one before. Vulnerable thumb curved down behind this protective mass. Lead with this knuckle, he told me, tapping on the first joint where my finger met my hand. And keep your fist in line with your arm, one unbroken line. That's your spear. As soon as I arrived, Tucson had frightened me. I had long been in the habit of going on extended solitary runs in the secret dusk of early mornings and the beckoning cool of sundowns. And as a runner, I preferred to do all the things women are instructed not to do: wear headphones, run without a shirt over my sports bra, leave the house without a plan. When I ran, I wanted freedom from the relentless decision tree of contemporary American life. The exercise soothed me into a creature closer to the animal I so often forget I am, mentally calm and physically alert, present in my body rather than in my mind. But the men of Tucson, they were fucking this up. Tucson is a dark city, the darkest city of its size in the United States, thanks to a low light ordinance that strictly limits artificial light to preserve visibility for the many astronomical observatories in Pima County. There are so few lights on many streets that you cannot see a person who is just feet away from you. The men lurched out of bushes, sidled out of recessed doorways, and screeched their trucks over to the shoulders of roads to snarl at me, dangerous like mountain lions, snakes, coyotes. I was used to New York, where everything is brightly lit and desolation is rare. I am not often afraid in New York. But in Tucson, I was afraid of men, and I hated myself for this fear, because I liked to think myself tough. I had cultivated that self-image with years of recklessness that looked like fearlessness. I sought so heedlessly before in my younger life, with every strange buzzer I leaned on, every dark building I walked into, every time I said yes to a dodgy proposition. I was not brave back then. I was numb. It is an important difference. And once I grew up, I was neither. I was well into my 30s when I moved to Tucson, and by then, the preciousness of my life would hit me out of nowhere, and I would lose my breath at red lights and coffee lines at the gym. It hit me so deep I sometimes cried, fast and sudden, over how much my life mattered to me. I thought too about its precarity, and so the wild-eyed, sun-parched faces of the bands of men I encountered on the running path by the cavernous dry riverbed, and the combination of urban menace and industrial desolation I found on the streets of my new city, they scared me. When I first met N, who is a Tucson native, a martial artist, and a professional combat coach, I mentioned this fear. He raised an eyebrow. Probably not the safest thing, running alone at night. I was already halfway through my eye roll when he continued, but I can teach you how to be safe. Back in the late 90s, I wasn't looking for safety from men. Rather, I was actively seeking men who would punch me in the face while we fucked. I wanted intensity, something fierce enough to puncture the suffocating cocoon of numbness I lived inside. Finding those men was more difficult than I imagined. This was the era of AOL chat rooms, the early years of Craigslist. I discovered there were two basic routes if getting hit is the thing you've decided you need. Find a man who knows he likes punching women in the face and hope he doesn't like it too much, or find a gentle man and convince him to punch you. Both approaches have drawbacks. What is wrong with you? Was a question I could read into my friends' long moments of eye contact and the worried furrows of their foreheads during the years I skulked the nastier corners of the sex web. They rarely spoke the question out loud, perhaps because of their familiarity with my proclivities and a vague commitment to sex positivity, but more likely because they knew they might have found themselves sliced cleanly out of my life for asking such things. Whatever was wrong with me was deeper and older than any of my friendships. I could have found new friends more easily than I could have found something else that offered me the same relief from the bondage of self I got from being punched in the face. How does it come to this? My roommate on Green Avenue once asked me gently. It was 2007 by then. I was in my late 20s, 10 years into my deep dive into violent sex. I had just careened into her dinner party with the white of one eye the color of an August tomato and the socket around it rapidly turning eggplant purple. She was weird enough herself that she knew I wouldn't feel judged by her exactly, more like inspected. I can't help what I like, I told her. That turned out not to be true, but I didn't know so at the time. In Tucson, the park was studded with clusters of people doing wholesome brunch time things. A huge springy gray dog bounded in circles around his white bearded person. Children climbed the jungle gym. Two couples walked the perimeter, mugs in hands, their dogs tugging on bright leashes. A leaf blower whined, every so often accompanied by the lowing hoot of the freight train that ran through the other side of the neighborhood. N held the palms of his hands up, just in front and outside of his face. We kicked our slippers off and faced each other, barefoot and squinting. He showed me, with one hand on my shoulder and the other on my hip, how to step, pivot, and throw my fist into his waiting palm. The first time, my body didn't understand. It tried to move the arm independently, my weight planted, my fist carrying little power and glancing flabbily off his hand. By the third time, though, I felt it, the gathering of force rising from foot through legs, hip, trunk, shoulder, the quick shift into a sideways-facing thing, shooting all my aliveness into one small place, the shocking thwack of my fist on N's hand like sneaker bottoms on pavement, the recoil I felt upon impact traveling back up my arm through my shoulder. N grinned at me. You're good at that. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Thank you. I'd really love to invite from the folks here, you could either write into the chat or if you know how to do this, you could raise your physical or your digital hand. If you have any questions or sort of reflections from a craft standpoint on what Margo just read. While we're waiting, I'd like to share just a couple things. First of all, I learned a word, which is precarity. I think I would have said precariousness, but precarity is such a beautiful word. And I just think like, I appreciate learning the word. And I don't know, it just feels to me like the emotional core of the piece, like the part that really grabbed me was like this quality of feeling numb and then occasionally being like overwhelmed by the preciousness of life. And it felt like that was kind of like almost like this sort of beating heart or this sort of like there's a movement back and forth between those things. And it felt like the kind of whole world, like Tucson being very like literally dark, and then people doing brunch stuff. But like there was this whole sort of world that kind of felt like it built up around that kind of core back and forth between like numbness and preciousness. And I could be completely off on that, but definitely the piece about feeling life as precious and having that be a new thing really moved me. And I wonder if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, I mean, that was an accurate read. I think this like toggling back and forth between being completely dissociated and checked out and then being consumed by intensity of various tones is something I was trying to not just like talk about, but sort of give the reader a little experience of, I guess.
Yeah, I think the suddenness of it, where it's like everything else is in kind of another vein, like it's in sort of embracing danger and working with numbness and that kind of thing. And then right in the middle, it's you're describing feeling, yeah, the preciousness of life. And it is very sudden, and it's sort of like jump cuts between like, in line at a coffee shop, and I can't remember the other couple places, but it kind of comes out of nowhere. Maybe, I guess that was on purpose.
Yeah, I mean, that's accurate to the experience. I don't know how how normal this is, but like I do feel like that. I feel often like I'm just taken aback by these days it's usually the weighty but ultimately good feeling of the value of my life, I think. But it comes out of nowhere.
Thank you, Sharon. Sharon, did I
Yeah.
see you?
Hi. Well, thank you, first of all, for sharing it and reading it. And if you were to ask me, like Sharon, what was the part that resonated or what, I honestly couldn't tell you because your words is what I felt. It's what I felt first. When we go to write, oftentimes we're looking for the words and I didn't have to find them. Like I physically was viscerally moving during some of the parts that you read. And so it's a piece that I felt viscerally. And so I would want to go back, obviously, and look to read, well, what were those exact words that made me feel that I couldn't express, when we're trying to figure that out. But thank you. Thank you for sharing it.
Thank you, Sharon. So we'll have time for Q&A at the end of our hour here. And so please feel free to um, you know, get your thoughts ready, both on what Margo read and then on the main topic today, which is confessional writing. Um, and so we'll just kind of go into some questions I've got prepared here. And if anything piques your interest, please bookmark it in your mind, and we'll have time for Q&A. So just starting with the basics, Margo, to you, what does confessional writing mean within nonfiction more broadly? What marks nonfiction out as confessional in your mind?
I mean, I think it's where we're sharing. I mean, it usually tends to be intimate information. So what is this about? It's about our relationships, it's about sexuality, it's about our bodies, it's about identity, the things that we could keep hidden if we chose to. And there is a pretty storied tradition of confessional writing in nonfiction from, Diaries of a British Opium Eater and Rousseau and on and on. And I think somewhere in the 90s, it got wrapped up with this very like Huffington Post, it happened to me, memoir industrial complex style of writing, which like I think is ultimately a good thing that we as a culture have gotten a little bit more accustomed to seeing people write about the things that we're like supposed to keep quiet about. I mean, I think there's some nuance there, but for me, it's like the bearing of something, right? The exposing of something that perhaps you feel like, for me it's always like I would never be able to go to like a social event and talk about this stuff, but somehow I can write it and like put it out into the world, and that's like a different it's a different lack of privacy, but something that I have the I think acculturated urge to sort of keep to myself.
That's really interesting. What about it makes it possible for you to write about it for the kind of world broadly, but bring it to a party. That's such an interesting sort of
I
duality.
I mean, I think it's just like the state of being this kind of a writer. It's not a comfortable way to live, I'll tell you that. But you know, when my book was getting ready to come out, I was thinking, I was so uncomfortable, and I was like, you know, the people who are really close to me, who I know, you know, feel deeply loved by and seen by, like those people, I feel fine reading the book. And like people who don't know me, I feel fine reading the book. But this sort of like interstitial circle of like people I see when I drop my kid off at school, and you know, somebody that I went to a class with one time, like that's what I was sort of terrorized by. And it made me think a lot about privacy, and identity, and the way that we try to function in society by acting as if we're fine all the time. And I'm just like not really interested in that. You know, I'm interested in something like a lot more sincere.
That's really interesting. So I guess a bit of a segue. What about confessional writing really attracts you? What do you really like about it? What's the thrill or the reward or the payoff of it in your experience?
I mean, I think that the space to engage with deep honesty is the draw for me, where there's something very, I mean, I guess there's like some element of taboo there, but also that it's like a space where we can slough off all of these conventions about how we're supposed to act and what is okay to put on social media in case our job sees it, and da, 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 and just say like this is real, this is how I think and what I've done and how I feel. Like there's something just like deeply magnetic about that to me. And I think it's the same reason that, you know, that people are drawn to anonymous fellowships and therapy. It's like a space where you can be real.
And what are the kind of trade-offs or drawbacks or challenges as you experience them?
Well, everyone knows your business. For one, like, you know, not to be grandiose, not like everyone, but like everyone who chooses to read, anyone with 1795 like gets to know my deepest darkest shames. And you know, I think for me there's a real misalignment between my values, which I feel very strongly about truth telling and about, you know, pushing back against the culture of privacy, and then also being like a totally sensitive person who like gets embarrassed all the time, you know, and so that misalignment can be hard.
Yeah, what that sense of more people than you might want knowing your business, like what is that? I'm trying to imagine what that would be like if I were to write, let's say, a memoir that said everything that I feel, and I don't know, like what does that look like week to week, day to day, month to month, like right when you are as you are now, like just publishing, you know, something highly intimate like Brutalities.
I mean, for me, it's like been sort of a slow build because I've been doing this work for a long time. And I have published in some like widely read spaces. And, you know, I wonder often, like the essay I read from, I published in the Sun about 3 or 4 years ago. And I sometimes I teach undergraduates, and sometimes I'm like, wow, I wonder if they've ever Googled me and read that. Um, and but you know, I think all of the promotion and all of the sort of like having your selfhood attached to a specific project that goes with the book like has definitely ratcheted that up. And I think so far, I mean, it's only been a few weeks, but for me it actually feels freeing, where like I was sort of holding on to these last bits of like maybe people won't read it, maybe this, and now I'm like whatever. Like it's done. Like, you know, you've shown up at the cocktail party with no clothes on, like you're here, it's happened. And you know, I think for me, like fear of shame is actually much harder to live with than like shame itself, because we all have shame. That's, you know, the human condition. But the anxiety of like wondering what it will feel like, I think is actually much more brutal.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So yeah, I see some questions from folks attending. So yeah, let's do that. Sandra, I see your hand.
Hi, thank you. I really got drawn into your story as you were reading. Great descriptions. My question is, do you use people's real names? And if so, how do you handle that legally? And do you go to them first and ask? And even if you don't use their real names, I know in my life, if I was describing something someone from my past might know that I was talking about them. They might remember it. So I'm wondering how you handle that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I'll just give a disclaimer that like there aren't really set best practices for this. And what I do is just the choice that feels correct to me. It's not meant to be prescriptive. The people who are currently in my life, I do talk to on some level, and it kind of depends on, my partner features heavily in this book, and he was very much involved in the research that I did, and saw my work from the infancy of the project, and wholeheartedly supports my doing this work and putting him and our life into it. And friends who appear more incidentally, like I asked them if they were comfortable. I would have been happy changing any of their names. I gave my partner an initial as a sort of gesture towards privacy for him. But the friends who appear, I don't think anyone asked me to change their name, though it wouldn't have been an issue to me to give them a pseudonym. And then, the person I write about a lot in here, whose name I did change, is my ex-partner, who I had a pretty troubled relationship with. And I did have a lawyer read the book. My publisher, gave the book a legal read. And I changed his name. Like, I have no wish to harm him or sort of like expose him. But I also feel a sense of agency and ownership over my own story. And the more I think about the idea that I should be restricted in talking about my own life, the more it seems just utterly absurd to me, to preserve someone else's comfort. So, I thought about what should go in and what should stay out. And there were some parts that I was like, you know what, this isn't integral to the story and it would probably be harmful and it doesn't need to go in. But the parts that really felt like they needed to be in there, I left them in. And, I was in a relationship with him for a long time. If you're good at using the internet, you can figure out who he is. And that's, I feel ethically clean about that. But I think it's a very situation by situation call.
Thanks.
Yeah, Sandra, do you have any sort of follow-up questions about that? It's a really good question.
Well, one thing I was thinking about is so many years ago that I don't want to tell you how many years ago, when I was a freshman in high school, my very first love. And it was such a long time ago, I have absolutely no idea where he is to ask him. So I would hesitate to use his real name because maybe he wouldn't want that used. So that was what brought the question up. So I really appreciate your answer. Thank you.
Yeah, Margaret, do you have, it seems like it's kind of a feel thing. Do you have any clear guidelines in your mind for me? It would be kind of like Sandra mentioned, it would be more like, oh, can I mention, who I dated in college and the fact that she was really nice or whatever, so it would be kind of like starting on the shallow end of the pool. But it's like, I don't know, do you just improv how to think about that, or are there guidelines in your mind that you've developed that have served you over time?
A little bit of both. I think that, like, broadly, I don't want to do anything that will cause someone harm or discomfort if it's not necessary. If it's just sort of like gossip in there. And, the nice thing about that is, like, that's not good for craft either. So, and Melissa Febos has written a lot about this, like, anything that's not serving the book, like, doesn't need to be in there anyway. And I've done a lot of sort of self-examination over looking for any desire to drag anyone through the mud, because I think that does sometimes live in us. Definitely as a younger writer, that lived in me, a sense of wanting to like expose someone. And I'm not writing from that place. If I was, that would be a different question. But I think it's like, who is this person in your life? If it's someone that you have an ongoing relationship with, then, the preservation of that relationship is something you need to think about. I wrote about my family in this book as well, in a way that I know will make them uncomfortable. I asked them not to read it. That'll be their choice whether they'll, choose to do that. But I wasn't willing to just say, oh, I won't write about my life, So I think, I again, like, this is not advice. But for me, there is a part of me that feels a strong sense of allegiance to my own story.
And it seems like a lot of decisions have to do with kind of what serves the work or the story, as opposed to I'll never write about somebody if it was more than 10 years ago or whatever. It's like, what is the story? And it sounds like is what's emerging.
Yeah, and there's that great quote, I think it's Mary Carr, where she's like, if you didn't want me to write about you, you should have acted better.
Gotcha. Will, I see your hand. Susan wrote something in the chat. Isn't there an unpredictability of sharing in public or a social event versus rehearsing and thoughtful exploration of truth in writing? Yeah, I'm curious, Margaret, to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such an astute comment. And she was referring to when I was talking about like, that I've written things in this book that I would never feel comfortable with chatting about. And yeah, I mean, a conversation is a totally unpredictable thing that is it's a back and forth, right? On the page, the writer is in control. And I think, I don't believe in writing as therapy, but I do think that there's something really powerful and to some degree a corrective experience about being able to express and unpack experiences you've had where like you were not in control, and have the authorial control to say, this is what happened, this is what I choose to share about it. And you also have the luxury of, as Susan said, like you have time, you can sit, you can process, you don't have to just, I'm not like speaking is not my finest space. And I wouldn't be a writer if it was. Do you know what I mean? Like I forever have that feeling after a hard conversation or a debate where I'm like, oh, that's the thing I should have said, but it's like a day later. And on the page, you put that in, like it's fine. It's a day later and it goes in there.
I'm really interested in, on a casual level, I'm just really interested in the topic of trauma. And a big commonality in trauma therapy is you experience something overwhelming in the past and it lives with you as trauma. And a big element of trauma therapy is re-experiencing that thing, but in a space where you do have agency and where it's not overwhelming. And as you said, I mean, I don't know the merits of thinking about writing as therapy, but I was really reminded of that when you were talking about what being able to write through something is like. Do you think it's had that effect for you ever, whether intentionally or unintentionally, where it almost helped you maybe process traumatic experiences? Do you think it had an effect that way?
I mean, yeah, it's definitely a space to process. I think when I say I don't believe in writing as therapy, like I don't believe that writing itself is a therapeutic modality. That's just like my experience, not to discount anyone else who has a different experience. But I do think that there is something that can feel, as someone in the chat just said, like very cathartic about coming to a new understanding of things that have happened to you, and seeing yourself in a different role as a character. I think, that can be in some ways a corrective experience. And, to some degree, it's a reenactment, right? And like, that's a lot of what therapy engages with. But, like, there's a reason that you don't give yourself therapy. Do you know what I mean? Like we're trying to fix the broken thing with the broken thing.
Right.
For me, like therapy requires, a person with hard skills who can facilitate that work.
Yeah, that really makes sense. Yeah. Will, I see your hand.
Hey, thank you. I was wondering if you could tell me, how do you find like the appropriate time and place to like share your confessional writing? Like, how do you find good avenues for that? And then once you do find an avenue, like how are you gonna tailor your story to that? Because I assume to be competitive, you need to be able to tailor it to what they're asking for in some way.
Yeah, I mean, do you mean like where to publish work?
Like where to publish work, but like where to find community, how to get better at it, how to get like good, proper feedback about it. Cause like, I mean, a lot of people are really nice in their feedback and that's great, but like nice feedback doesn't necessarily help you get better. I apologize. I have dogs. I don't know if you guys can hear that, but
Yeah, so having a avenue to feedback that, as you're getting at, is honest and searching, is, you know, the best thing that I've ever done for my writing. And you can get that in a lot of spaces. Like I got that in my MFA program, but you can also get that by taking workshop classes. You can get that by working with a writing coach. You can get that through informal like accountability groups. You know, a lot of my students have, you know, groups of little cells of 2 or 3 or 5 of them that will exchange work. I have, you know, early readers that I exchange work with, and building those relationships so that people know your work and so that you are comfortable enough to say like, hey, this isn't working. And to be able to really take that in is super valuable. And then if you're talking about, you know, where to put work out in the world, I've always just put this work with the other work. Like, I don't really like to think of it as siloed or separate in terms of like where we publish it. So that's just what I've done. And that's worked okay for me. But you know, there are a lot of anthologies depending on like your subject matter. Like I think anthologies are a great space because they're usually pretty topical. There's a lot of, you know, different trauma writing anthologies, and there's a great one called What My Mother and I Don't Talk About. It's like essays on stuff like the traumas of young adulthood and childhood that, you know, in the frame of how you would talk to your mother about it. There's probably more. I can't think of any right now.
Thank you. So there's some good questions in the chat. Shirley asks, are there good writing courses online for memoir writing? So you are asking absolutely the right people. You know, I manage writers.com, and Margo has actually a confessional writing course coming up in January for anybody who's really interested in this topic. So I'll be speaking about that at the end of the hour. But yeah, go to writers.com if you haven't, because we're running memoir courses every month for the most part. Lena asks, what helped you to overcome the fear/anxiety around sharing very intimate or sensitive stories?
I haven't. Like, I still have it. I just do it anyway. And I think for myself, as long as I was going to wait until I felt comfortable, I was never going to, you know, maybe I was going to make work, but I wasn't going to show it to anyone. And probably I wasn't even going to make honest work. But, you know, I think as part of the rest of my life experiences, I have just gotten kind of used to doing things that make me feel very uncomfortable. And that was, you know, and now it's just one of those things. But it's, you know, it's a totally harrowing thing to do to yourself. And, you know, I think there are times that it's a good push and times that, like, you know, you might not just like, you don't need that all the time. And there was a long period of my life, I think, when I was more engaged with stuff that was actively harming me, that I both lacked the perspective and I didn't have the bandwidth to sort of push myself to put myself out there, you know, because I was already like so out there in so many ways. So like, I think taking good care of yourself is a way to not necessarily overcome the fear, but like support yourself through showing up for it.
Was there kind of a moment or an inflection point in your writing life where you began to write and share some of these things more openly? Like, it sounds like there was a period of contemplating and then in a period of doing it. And I'm wondering, do you remember when that happened and what that was like?
Yeah, I mean, the first piece I published was A Modern Love, and it was, you know, now looking back, I'm like, oh, why was I so distressed about that? But it felt so revealing. Like, I referenced my addiction history, and I referenced, you know, the discord in my family, and I can't remember what else. Like, it felt like a tremendous amount of exposure, and it's like obviously a very widely read, you know, column. And that was the first thing I put out. So it was like, I was like, okay, I guess we're doing this. But before that, I had just really suppressed my desire to create work and be a writer. Like, I really, for 2 decades, I thought I was not a creative person. And I would say that like in those words. And I think I was just so scared that I couldn't even, like, it couldn't even bubble to the surface.
Is the Modern Love essay kind of the first? In other words, did your writing career start with that piece, that confessional piece, or were you doing kind of writing leading up to it?
I mean, I had just started writing like sometime that year. That was like the year I started writing. Um, yeah.
And what was it like, sort of diving in that way and like the year around that? Do you remember any like was it fine? Was it super uncomfortable, or both?
It was like all of those things. And, it was also like that publication is such a moonshot. I remain surprised that I got it. Um, that I was just sort of bewildered by, I just like, what I told myself was, I loved reading the column. I was like, you should write one of those and just like send it out and it'll be good practice at getting, rejection because everyone says the life of the writer is full of rejection, which it is. And then, they like took my essay. So I was like, okay, that didn't work for that. And I was very, I was obviously like very, very happy and remain so grateful to Dan Jones for publishing me. Um, and then also like my life was really chaotic and painful, and I wasn't really in a space to invest in myself as a creative person at that time, but I was writing. I was writing this like narrative project that lives in a drawer now, but I started writing every day, and it gave me the ability to start taking myself seriously as a writer, which is something that was the hard one for me, so it helped a lot with that.
That's really cool. Steve is asking a question that I think is pretty similar to what we were just discussing, but I'll just go ahead and read it. When did you feel ready to write about past traumatic experiences? Was there an experience in your life or a deep urge to get all your thoughts on paper that compelled you to dive deep into your past? Did you feel you were ready to face your past?
There was no single moment. I'm a New Yorker, so I've been in therapy since I was 11. So like I'm not particularly uncomfortable talking and thinking about the worst parts of my life. And I think like that's an asset if you want to do this kind of work. So it's not like there was a decade that I hadn't thought about and I had to face it. Like I didn't really have that experience. But looking back in retrospect, I do think it was like um when I started wanting to like make a lot of moves to change my life, that I became curious about it as material in a different way because I was stepping out of it a little bit. I was like changing and changing the way I was living. And so before that, it was just sort of like it wasn't remarkable. It was just the ecosystem of what was happening. And then when I was like, oh no, I've been doing very weird things. And then they became, a little more interesting to me. And I was also able to have perspective on them, that allowed me to reflect, which at the time I lacked completely.
Got it. Yeah, I think a lot of life is only strange in retrospect, sort of. So it sounds like there's a little bit of that.
Yeah.
Susan asks, were there times when you thought something you were writing was too much, and then how did you revise to include it, or did you decide not to include it?
Yeah, I mean, there's some stuff that I choose not to write about, and like maybe I'll change my mind about that. Um, but I think like when you say too much, like there are definitely some experiences that I've chosen not to write graphically about. And the consideration of like how do we represent something on the page is for me not usually like is it in or is it out, but it's like are we experiencing this in scene? Is the reader really immersed in it? Or are we referencing it more obliquely and like using a lot more restraint? Um, so I don't have anything that I'm like, I'll never write about it. Do you know what I mean? But I do, my book ends right before the birth of my child. And part of that was like I finished my first draft before they were born. But part of it was like I had not processed that experience yet. And I still don't feel on a craft level really like ready to put that on the page in a way that I will feel good about. So it's just like I'm not yet interested in writing about it.
Speaking about the experience of writing um, very intimate or personal things, how do you find that affects the actual prose that you write? Like, it feels like For me, it feels like when I've attempted to write those things, it kind of comes out very frank. Like I feel pushed towards like a frank tone because otherwise it's sort of like, here you go. Like it feels like the tone that I get pushed into, and which I enjoy. I mean, and I find it kind of fun and sort of thrilling. But I'm just curious, yeah, what your experience is of writing about these things in a prolonged way, and does it move the prose in a particular direction? How does it feel to write?
I mean, I think the tonal dynamics have to shift a lot, and I don't have like a formula, but there is definitely always a play between the deep voice where we're talking directly to the reader, we're not performing, we're really like giving the most unvarnished, vulnerable expression of what is going on, and like a much more stylized, representation of something that is more like writerly, if you will. I don't ever really want to read something that's all of the latter, because I'm like, tell me what's really going on. And I write, not that I write for only myself, but like I write for the reader who is me, for my own taste. And I teach a class on body writing where we talk a lot about, the balance between being able to write a vivid, detailed scene that is really, all senses are attended to, like you can really feel yourself in the scene, and then just using like plain spoken language to say this is what's happening. And so I think it's really about the interplay between those things, not necessarily like choosing a lane.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I'd love to hear more. Like how you choose what to really go into sensorially, and how you choose to work with things in a more summary way. Obviously there's no formula, but if you had to write a
Well, a lot of
chapter.
it's about pacing, right? So like in summary, we move a lot faster. So if I want to get somewhere, like I'll always do that. And if I want the reader to spend some time in something, that's where we want to slow down, or where I want to slow down with description and really like beckon them into the scene. And for me, I do a lot of what I call like idea writing also, which is like essaying into the themes and concepts sort of outside of the narrative aspect of um the essay, or whatever we're calling it, the memoir, the essay, the memoir essay. So it's sort of a balance between those three things, right? We have like exposition, scene, and then the essay voice. And for me, like the balance of those three things is what makes something propulsive and engaging to read. And none of the three will keep me interested for that long on their own, like absent some like really enticing material. So I do try to say, like, what are we getting from each of those three things? Like with story, that's where we get the propulsive nature of the work. We get, like readers are very attuned to story. We are creatures who respond to narrative and cause and effect and sequence. So you want to have enough of that to keep it moving. But then it's like, what does this thing mean, right? That's the idea writing. And then the scene is where we get to actually feel it. So, it's like all the things all the time.
What made you choose or gravitate toward the form of a memoir and essays as opposed to, let's say, just a more conventional memoir?
Well, I had written actually a much more conventional memoir before this that lives in a drawer. And I think I just became less interested in it after I did that. I mean, I enjoy reading work like that, but I wanted to do something weirder, and I wanted to play with form. And I also I wanted to write about a bunch of disparate worlds, right? Like this book, there's our essays about sex work, there are essays about mixed martial arts, there's essays about farming, about ironwork, chronic illness, compulsive exercise. Like there's a lot in there. And I don't know if it would hang together in a satisfying way as a narrative memoir without being like, I did this and then I did this and then I did this, which is like my least favorite kind of thing to read. So I wanted to really like go right into the heart of everything and use the shape of the essay um as like a way in.
Sharon asks, what does your writing practice look like? Are you structured with when and how and your space while you're writing? And she also asks, Who was the first person you shared your writing with? What, was it the New York Times or was it an acquaintance?
So I have a toddler, which is like, if you're familiar with them, they're not great for routine. Before I had a child, I did write every day. I did morning pages every day, like pretty religiously. And I typically would write 500 words a day. That's how I wrote my whole book. I cannot sit and write for 4, 5, 7 hours like some folks can. So I try to be like really regular, short sessions. Now that I have a kid, it's like, catch it where you can. The last time I worked on my current project was in July. And it is much more of I went to a residency and I had, 2 weeks of working for long hours each day because I had, someone taking care of my kid and all my human needs met. But I'm hoping that people tell me that once the kids grow up, it's easier. And it is always my goal to have, if not a daily practice, then at least like a regimented weekly practice. I do very well with structure. My space, this is my space, as you can tell, it's pretty minimalist. I like it like that. I need a dedicated space. I cannot sit up in a coffee shop and pay attention. I don't want any music. I really just like want to be in a white box with nothing going on. So like I did my best to create that for myself. And the first person I shared my work with, I mean, maybe not like the first person ever in life, but I had a writing partner who's still a dear friend, Vicky Wicker, if you're listening to this. And I lived in this like really remote part of upstate New York, and she was my only neighbor, and I could walk to her house. And my house was pretty chaotic, both structurally, it was falling down. And then I lived with this man who was a lot. And she lived by herself, and her home was so beautiful and warm. And she always had snacks, and we smoked cigarettes at the time. So we would go over there and we would have an American spirit, and she would make us a little meal and we'd write, and then we'd read our work out loud to each other. And we did that pretty much every day for quite a while. And it got me in the practice of reading my work, and also of listening to someone else's work and really like reading as an editor. And I'm so grateful like that. That's a great kind of relationship to foster.
Thank you. Kate asks, for you, where is the line between, in scare quotes, fact and fiction? Like, to what extent are you okay with taking creative license, especially with details you may not have vivid recall of? I have written only history until the past couple of years, and I'm now turning to autobiographical fiction, a lot of which, but not all, is memoir. So I think especially with things that are more, intensely personal, how do you navigate that? Faulty memory or, combining things for the sake of story? I think interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I take a pretty hard line on it. I don't create any composite characters or scenes. I will compress time, because nobody wants to read a 1,200-page book about every day of the last 10 years of my life. But that's about it. And in terms of, taking creative license with details, I do not do that. That said, and there's a author's note in the front of my book that says this, like, the human memory is not a recording device, and we see this over and over again with eyewitness testimony. You can, if you turn to your partner tonight and ask them to remember an event, like, you will remember it differently than they do, down to details. Like, my whole family has this long-standing debate over this Rolling Stones concert that like half of us truly believe we were at, and the other half were like, that didn't happen. So, memory is not a recording device. And for me, a lot of the things I was writing about were, only either one or two people were there. There's no way to sort of fact check it to a journalistic standard of integrity. So I did my best. I researched and fact checked as I was able. And I did a lot of, sitting very quietly and trying to reenact my memories. And then I said, that's what I can do. And I didn't make anything up, and that is the truth to my best ability to tell it. But I will say, if you're interested in if like that kind of allegiance to objective truth is not particularly interesting to you, like, autofiction that's where it's at, and it's really, I think, enjoying kind of a moment right now. And I think a lot of people like write nonfiction who might be happier writing autofiction and end up sort of stuck in this thing where they're like, I want to tell a story, but not exactly the story that happened. And then they have like a James Frey situation. So if you're like write autofiction, it's awesome.
Kate, do you have any follow-up around that?
Well, like someone else, my dogs just chose that moment to just go berserk barking. So they've stopped for a moment, but I'll try to. I guess one thing I've just never been like a visual person in terms of memory. So just little things like the color of the couch or what was the weather like that day or, like those kind of details. Now, in autofiction, of course, it's fine to use fiction, but I just was curious, that whole James Frey thing was kind of interesting. But it seems like if you just lined up 30, memoirs and, some people are calling it autofiction, there's a lot of interweaving. So I was really thinking about those kind of details, although, I appreciate your comment about the composite character and the fact that you don't do that. I have done that, but, it's a different genre. So thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Oh, there are the dogs. I have 2 dogs downstairs. They're being really nice, which I'm happy about. And also, Margo, I have a 4-year-old, and it's actually a lot easier than it was when she was 2. Or it's like so far the difficulty curve is kind of like this every year. We'll see. Everybody says that, and then they're like, oh, when she's 13, I believe it. But yeah, it does. Yeah, but it has really gotten easier, just for what it's worth. Okay, so we're coming up on time here. If you've got something burning, please put it into the chat. And I want to return to somebody's wonderful question: are there good writing courses online for memoir writing? Actually, yes. Again, writers.com is very good for that. And I want to alert everybody to a course that we and Margo are running together. It starts on January 10th. And it's the first time we've done something like this, but it is specifically a course for confessional writing. It's called Secrets and Confessions, Writing Deeply Personal Nonfiction. And the approach that we're taking in the course, we really co-designed with Margo. The course includes well, not only the ability, but in fact, the way the course works is that everybody who takes it anonymously, like using a pseudonym. So it's really a chance to share things that you might not otherwise share in a course that's not structured this way. So Margo, I just wondered if you wanted to say anything about the process of designing this course, and I could certainly share. It was kind of an idea that came from our staff because we felt it could be so exciting to have a course where in a safe environment that's held so that it's a good experience for people, where people could really know that it's okay to unburden ourselves a little bit more than we might otherwise. And we just realized we'd never tried anything like that. So Margo, if you want to say anything about how you've designed the course, which I think is absolutely wonderful, I'd love to hear.
Yeah, so the course will be 2 months long, and it's really part of one of the priorities for me was to build a space that feels safe and generative, right? Because like often we have one and not the other, where as someone mentioned, you get the feedback like it's great, which is like so unhelpful, kind, but not useful. And then on the other hand, like when we're writing this deeply personal stuff, like I don't ever want like cutting criticism from a stranger on it on my first draft. Like what, like that sounds harrowing. So what I want to build and what we're going to build in this class is a space where we really take care of each other's work. And I was thinking about like what are the sort of frictions of sharing this kind of work and making it in community. And what I hear from a lot of people is just like, I'm not ready to put my name on it. I'm not ready to put it out there. Like I feel self-conscious, embarrassed, like all of these things. And so this is a space that allows you to just sort of like bypass that a little bit. And you can try out your fun author pen name that you've always wanted to try. And just, take a moment away from identity and really just focus on the work.
Thank you. Yeah, so if you're interested in trying your hand at this, please check that out. And more broadly, for any kind of creative nonfiction writing you'd like to do, have a look at writers.com. We run courses, multiple per month. So Karen asks what topics are covered in the new course. Obviously, you would be writing about whatever you like. There is also course material in the course, sort of helping get folks oriented and learn craft elements, and you can find those in the course description, which I linked in the chat. So thank you so much, Margo. This was wonderful. Does anybody have anything burning before we close? I'll just give it a couple seconds for you to type. Okay, Margo, thank you. This was wonderful. Really appreciate it. And everybody, please check out Margo's new memoir and essays, which I'm going to link here in the chat. It's called Brutalities, a Love Story. It's out now with W.W. Norton, and you can buy it wherever books are sold. So please have a look at the book. I've read large, like reasonably large sections of it. It's beautiful, beautifully written. It's very gripping. So please check it out.
Thank you all. Thanks for this time. Hope to see you in class.
Thank you. Okay, good night, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.